Can small guilds work in Ashes of Creation? Intrepid has been toying around with the idea of creating systems that will enable small guilds to be viable, but as a long-term MMORPG player, I'm very skeptical of this, so let's get into it. So how are they going to do it? How are they going to make small guilds viable? Well, the number one thing they have is the guild leveling system. As you rank your guild up, you can choose to gain perks or increase the size of your guild roster. To have the full suite of perks, the max guild size is going to be roughly 30 to 50 players. And if you fully increase the size of your guild, the max guild size will be 300 players. So you'll have to choose between having guild perks, which will increase your player power in some regard. Some of these were in Alpha 1 and included things like health regen. I'm sure they don't even know what they're going to do for the guild perks. But essentially, you're choosing between the size of your guild versus player power or player convenience. I could see, just all sorts of little knick-knack bonuses being tied to the system, but that is the gist of the system. Player power versus larger guild. Overall, I do really like the idea of giving small guilds perks and just some incentive to not join the big guys. Even if this doesn't work in practice, even if for the most part everybody just joins the big guild, having some pressure to just not conglomerate and not zerg up, I think will go a long way. Even if it doesn't work, even if it's not much, just a little bit of pressure I think will help. I don't think any of these small guilds are expecting these perks to enable them to just go head-to-head and beat the big guilds in a face-to-face conflict. I don't think anybody's expecting that. I don't even think that's the intention of the system overall. But if you could create some bonuses that allow for smaller guilds to maybe do some form of guerrilla warfare more easily, some skills, some perks, things like that, that enable them to just be the thorn in the side of the bigger guild. Yeah, I think that'd be pretty cool, and I think a lot of people will have fun with that. Before we go any further, I think we need to define what small guilds being viable even means. I am somebody that is a small guild enjoyer, and I think I can speak for most. I don't think small guilds want to win. They're not looking to own the metropolis, own the server. They just want a reason to exist. Doesn't sound like a big ask, but man, in most MMOs, being a small guild is entirely pointless. You are just better in every single way to just join the big guys, especially if it's a PvP game. They just want a reason to exist. They're not looking for much. They just want a reason to stay small. Sadly, in most MMOs, especially the ones that have PvP, more players is always better. There is never a reason to not be in the larger guild and to not be as big as possible. There's never any sort of penalties, no sort of upkeep or, feeding the troops or whatever sort of dumb mechanic they never implement in properly. More is always better. It's always easier, and it's what everyone does because there's never actually any reason, no pressure at all to stay small. This problem really rears its ugly head when you start talking about open world PvP games and games that don't have any player capped content where everything is just completely dynamic and you can bring as however many people as you want and it can be 100v20. Here's where you run into a problem with that. Because the optimal strategy in these games where there's no player caps is to recruit. It doesn't matter how good you are. It doesn't matter how good your gear is. Your time and effort, if you genuinely want to win, your time and effort is best spent getting more bodies. I don't care how good you are at the game. I don't care how geared you are. More is always better. Outside of maybe a few games that have had like crazy abilities that multiplicatively add damage based off how many targets they hit. That's really the exception. But even in those games, still usually zerging was the play. But yes, in these games, more is always better, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because not only is your guild doing it, their guild is doing it. So everybody just keeps bringing more and more and more, and it's an arms race. And then inevitably, when you do have a PvP conflict, it's such a laggy death ball that player skill, there's no expression for actual player skill. It's just a lag fest because everybody's trying to bring more than the next guy. There are a few reasons why smaller guilds could work in Ashes of Creation compared to other games, so let's talk about that. The first incredibly obvious exploit with this guild size system is big guilds breaking down into smaller guilds, so they are effectively a big guild, but they have all the small guild perks. That's the first thing everybody saw coming from a mile away, including Intrepid. They are aware that people are going to do this. They expect people to do this, but they are creating systems in the game that will create friction and make it a little bit harder to just easily do this. So let's talk about that. First thing being the guild alliance system. So all the competitive guilds are going to be in alliances, whether that's with other guilds or with themselves and their sub guilds. Luckily, the alliance cap is 4 guilds. So if you want to break apart into 4 smaller guilds, your effective max guild size is going to be 120 to 150. And if you want to have full roster size and be the biggest alliance possible, then the max guild size would be 300 per guild with 4 guilds in the alliance. So 1,200 players. So that, I think, is working for them. I think that will create some friction. The guild alliance size being hard capped at 1,200 players is something that's working in favor of the smaller guilds. Now, this 1,200 player cap is assuming all 4 guilds take 0 perks, which I imagine most alliances won't do. But even if you have 1,200 man alliances, that sounds like a lot, but Ashes of Creation is going to have a large world, and they're aiming for 8,000 to 10,000 concurrent players at a time. So that's like 3 to 6% of the population, depending on who's logged in and who isn't, which I don't think is that bad. And I suspect even the large guilds that break down into sub-guilds will not be doing the full roster size. I imagine they'll have 1 or 2 small sectors that get the perks for their PvPers and their no-lifers, and the other 2 guilds will be maxed out at 300 or 200 or whatever. So I don't really think we're going to be seeing too many 1,200 man alliances. They have also said that there's going to be quite a bit more friction when it comes to guilds and alliances in general with this game due to the way nodes work and citizenship and land ownership. So hopefully there's a few more things sort of gluing people down to where just jumping around exploiting the system to its fullest capacity is not very effective. But we'll have to actually get in the game to see that. Another big win for small guilds is that travel time is a big deal in Ashes of Creation. The world is going to be very large, and there's going to be extremely limited fast travel. Big guilds do very well in games where they can just say, all right, everybody, Hearthstone back to Orgrimmar, and then take the portal to wherever. When you can quickly assemble a large group of people, then that large group of people is an incredibly powerful tool. But if you're a small guild harassing a big guild and it takes them an hour to properly respond to you with force, then that's a big deal, because you can, guerrilla warfare tactics become much more effective when you can't just have a Zerg get summoned on you. Moving, force projecting around the map becomes very difficult when, if you want to attack these guys, you have to assemble your troops, and it might take an hour to get everybody where they need to be. And that's assuming, people are getting picked off and whatever, a lot of things can happen in that time. Whereas in most MMORPGs, it's very quick to assemble everybody all at once, and you just ride out as a big Zerg and do whatever you need to do. I do think small guilds might stand a chance in Ashes of Creation, but there's definitely some things I think they need to do, so let's talk about that. Number 1, relying on social friction is just not enough. That's the one thing I see thrown around a lot. Oh, the big guilds are going to have a lot of internal strife and, all the politics. Yes, that does happen, but we're in a very different era than we were than the early 2000s. When everybody was 12 years old that was playing these games, you could rely on the social friction a little bit more, but we are in a very different era of gaming organizations now. The guilds coming into these games are organized. They have discords. They have members that have been in these guilds for years that are in their 30s with kids that go to each other's weddings, and it's a very different beast, much more organized. These organizations are an entirely different beast than what we were dealing with in the early MMO days, and they have tools that enable them to really be even more powerful and take advantage of their economies of scale, Discord, VOD reviews. Like, the game is so different now than it was back then with these older MMOs that Ashes is trying to emulate. So just relying on the social friction and the chaos of being in a big guild is not nearly enough. So let's get into my hottest take of this video, and that is that I think Ashes of Creation cannot be exclusively uncapped large PvP. You're seeing this in Throne and Liberty right now, where if every objective is an uncapped large PvP scenario, then you are pretty much only creating content for the largest guilds. I think that this is important. I do want to have the large node sieges and the large castle sieges and just the chaos of open world PvP where you don't know if there's 10 players over that hill or 1 player over that hill. I like that. I think most people want that in the game, but I think you need to have some content that is more player number controlled. You need to have, sure, you have that castle over there, and that is a 250 v 250 objective. Great. Nobody has problems with that existing, but I think you also need to have some content that's maybe a 5v5 objective that's on a timer. Why not? You have 250 v 250. Why not have a 5v5 thing over here? Much smaller, much less important, not nearly as juicy, but have a 5v5 thing, an 8v8 thing, a 20v20 thing. You need to have more sizes of player-controlled content that these smaller guilds can actually do and not just get zerged down in. That, I think, is the number one thing that will help small guilds exist, because if a small guild can be like, hey, we're gonna be like a campground focused, whatever the objectives are, we're gonna specifically really go after these towers, and these are our objectives. If you give the smaller guilds some objectives that are achievable, then you'll probably start seeing some smaller guilds. And it's very important that these smaller objectives are tied to the world. I don't want a detached arena system. I do not want a detached battleground system. That is a failure. Having some other siloed system in the game that is not putting people in the world and not directly affecting the overworld is a failure for this game. I do not want that. I love arenas in WoW. I love small scale coordinated PvP, but it's very important that it has to be tied to the world. I do not want any sort of side game where, there's people over in the town, sitting in Stormwind queuing arenas all day. No, you need to actually go out in the world and go through an instance portal of some kind. Think of like Hellgates from Albion. It needs to be in the world. It needs to be tied to the world. That is incredibly important, but more objectives than just 250 v 250 or random uncapped open world objectives. Then, throw a little bone to the small guilds, or even the big guilds. The big guilds also like to do 10v10s and 8v8s and these PvP objectives that are more than just chaos. But I also want the chaos too. I like that too, but just some small scale stuff, please. Just a little bit will go a long way. Next up, friendly fire. Friendly fire should be enabled for people that are not in an official alliance. This will make it a little bit harder for, the LOD Alliance 1 and LOD Alliance 2 to coordinate and both attack the same person. Will it still happen? Absolutely, because it's a tab target game and friendly fire is not as effective in a tab target game versus action, but this game does still have some action skills, and naturally when you see a whole bunch of red on your screen, things get jumbled. It makes it harder. It's a deterrent. Is it the best deterrent? No, but it's just another one you can throw in there to help. So you don't want a Throne and Liberty situation where you can somehow configure your settings to not tab to your unofficial allies. No, none of that. That can't exist. There needs to be friendly fire, absolutely, between unofficial alliances. Next up, you're going to have to limit how frequently you can rearrange guild alliances and join guilds. You're probably going to have to put a 7-day timer on joining a guild, meaning if you join a guild, you can't join another one for 7 days. You're going to have to do stuff like this because people will just rearrange the guilds to exploit the system and cheese it. Some of you are probably saying, who's going to just join and kick, and who's going to do all that work to do all that? You're right. People won't do it. They'll write programs to do it, because I've seen it happen before where somebody will write a program that just kicks everybody and reinvites all the people to guild A they need to. People will absolutely do that. So you're going to have to put some sort of timer on there to where that is not as effective. The next thing I'd like to see is perks for not being in an alliance at all. If you are genuinely just a 30-man or 50-man guild out on your own, doing your own thing, maybe you're a pirate guild or something, cool. I think you should maybe get a little bonus for that to incentivize that. I think that's kind of a cool thing that can exist. Next thing I'd like to see is some sort of buy-in for joining an alliance. I don't want to see guild alliances be this weird thing where it's like you're allied with this guy this day and this guy this next battle. I'd like to see it more concrete. Not that I don't want to see it change at all, but I think there should be a bit of a buy-in. I think it should be more of a slow-moving system where joining and leaving alliances is more of a big deal than just people interacting with menus and willy-nilly doing it. The next thing I'd like to see is guild objectives that are on a per-player basis. Crowfall did this, where a small guild would have their efforts divided by their guild player count, and big guilds would as well. So a 500-man guild would need to do 10 times the work of a 50-man guild. Now, obviously, you're going to have a minimum player divisor, otherwise you'll have one-man cheese guilds. But I think that this concept overall and having some objectives that are on a per-player basis will empower the small guilds to compete with the big guilds because they know they can maybe be more efficient than them, and I think that's cool. And the final thing you can do to empower smaller guilds is to have high skill expression classes. Or, more importantly, to not have a few that are so brain dead easy that anybody can get 80% effectiveness out of. This was a problem in Crowfall, where you had things like the Stormcaller Druid, which was just incredibly easy. You could get 80% of the value of a Stormcaller out of somebody that was playing with a Nintendo Switch controller, because there was just not a lot of skill expression there, so much so that if there was a siege in Crowfall, I would look over to my girlfriend and be like, guess what? You're playing Crowfall. And I'd be like, here's your Stormcaller Druid. Face this direction and press 222 on the keyboard. That's all I need you to do. That's it. And it worked. I mean, that as crazy as it sounds, there were classes, specific specs in that game that were so easy that anyone could do it. And when you have things like that in the game, it's going to enable Zergs. Another thing they could do in Ashes is have smart anti-Zerg abilities where, you know, if this ability hits more than 5 people, it just starts doing multiplicatively more damage. It's hard to balance. I'm not exactly expecting that because games have kind of gotten away from that kind of stuff for server performance reasons. But if you had some very clever anti-Zerg abilities, Zerg busters, that would be cool. I'm not expecting that, but it would be neat. I'd like to see it. But overall, if the classes are just have higher skill expression, if it just takes more to get, 80% effectiveness out of a class than just being brain dead easy, then you're just going to see smaller, more coordinated groups do well. So what's the verdict? Do I have any confidence that Intrepid will make small guilds worthwhile in any capacity? No, I have no confidence at all. I'm excited for the game still, but this is a very difficult problem to solve, especially with how organized guilds are nowadays. And the main thing why I have no confidence in them in doing this is because they're going to have to draw some very hard lines in the sand. If they genuinely want to pull this off and genuinely make small guilds worthwhile, they're going to have to do some things that will affect innocent bystander players that aren't even playing the game in a competitive sense, because they're going to have to create safeguards to avoid the cheesing, obviously, from the larger guilds. And innocent non-competitive players will get wrapped up in that. Things like limiting guilds, guild invites, and guild alliances, and things like that. There's going to have to be a lot of hard lines in the sand to make it worthwhile. Will they do it? I mean, I'd love if they did it. I'm a small guild enjoyer, but overall, I'm not confident in it. Even though I'm not confident in their ability to balance this right, I still think you would see small guilds if there was some small-scale PvP content that these guilds could play where they wouldn't get zerged. If there's just any of that, I think you're still going to see players play in small guilds, because there's a lot of people that just like being in those interpersonal small guilds. And if they have some objectives they can do and they can compete with at a 1-to-1 level with the big guys, I think you're going to see it. I think you're still going to see these small guilds exist. Really just any pressure to not join the Zerg, I think, will help a lot. Even if these perks are kind of minimal, I still think you're going to see a few small guilds be like, hey, you know what? We want to be small. They're throwing us a bone here. And yeah, there's not really a point in doing it, but we get a little bonuses, right? It's kind of nice. So I do still appreciate the pressure to not just be as big as possible. We're really just going to have to get our hands on it and play it. But I'd love for them to prove me wrong. I would love for Intrepid to make a serious attempt at making small guilds viable and worthwhile. But it's going to be difficult, because they're going to have to draw hard lines in the sand that people are going to get upset about, and they're going to have to create content that these smaller guilds can do and actually compete with at a 1-to-1 level, which is a lot of work. It's a lot, because you got to actually do the thing. So let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Have a good one. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to subscribe with notifications on, follow me on Instagram and Twitter, and join the Discord. It's free.